Ethan pulled up to the driveway of his suburban home, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His flight from Denver had landed earlier than expected, and he decided not to tell his wife, Rachel, hoping to surprise her. They had been married for nearly 10 years, their love weathering the usual ups and downs, or so he thought. Today, he had something special planned, a surprise vacation to the Maldives for their upcoming anniversary. The tickets rested safely in his briefcase, waiting to sweep her off her feet. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed something unusual. Parked beside Rachel's SUV was a sleek black Mercedes, a car he didn't recognize. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a colleague from work or a friend. But the blinds in the house were closed, something they never did during the day. His stomach churned with unease, but he pushed the thoughts aside. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Quietly, Ethan unlocked the front door and slipped inside. The house was still, unnaturally quiet. He placed his briefcase on the table and began climbing the stairs, intending to find Rachel and give her the surprise of her life. But halfway up, a soft, muffled laugh stopped him in his tracks. It was Rachel's laugh, but it wasn't a laugh she shared with him anymore. There was something in the tone, intimacy, joy, the kind of laugh reserved for private moments. Ethan's heart sank, and then a man's voice followed, deep and warm, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. Ethan gripped the banister, his knuckles turning white. This isn't happening, he thought, but his feet continued moving, as if propelled by some force beyond his control. He reached the top of the stairs and saw that the bedroom door was slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, he could see the edge of their bed. On it, Rachel lay with a man he didn't recognize, her body pressed against his, the sheets draped loosely over them. Ethan's world shattered in that instant. He stood frozen, a sick feeling of betrayal twisting his insides. His eyes blurred with tears, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the scene before him. The room, their room, once a place of love and trust, was now a battleground of deception. The tickets to the Maldives crumpled in his hand. What was meant to be a gift of love now felt like the cruelest joke. Without making a sound, Ethan turned and descended the stairs, his heart pounding. Rage, sorrow, and disbelief crashed over him in waves. But he managed to keep his composure long enough to reach the kitchen. There, he collapsed into a chair, staring at the plane tickets. His hands trembled as he fought to process what he had just witnessed. How long had this been going on? Who was the man in his bed? And why hadn't he noticed sooner? Ethan's mind raced, searching for answers in the mundane details of the past few months. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through text messages, emails, anything that might have hinted at the betrayal that had been festering right under his nose. But there was nothing. He had been blind, and now he was broken. Hours passed in a blur. The sun had begun to set by the time Ethan heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. Rachel was home. His pulse quickened as he heard her footsteps approach the kitchen. "Ethan," she called, her voice carrying a casual, unsuspecting tone. She walked in and stopped short when she saw him sitting at the table, his face pale and drawn. "Oh my God, you're home early," she exclaimed, forcing a smile. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes hard and cold. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. "I wanted to surprise you," he said quietly, his voice betraying none of the storm raging inside him. Rachel shifted nervously. "Well, that's sweet," she said, faltering under his gaze. "Is everything okay?" For a moment, Ethan considered confronting her right then and there. He wanted to scream, to demand answers. But something inside him told him to wait, to gather more than just the visual proof he'd witnessed earlier. He needed to be sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, before he detonated the bomb that would blow apart their lives. "I'm fine," Ethan lied, standing up from the table. "Just tired from the trip. I think I'll head to bed early." Rachel watched him, her expression unreadable. "Okay, I'll join you in a bit," she said softly, clearly relieved that he wasn't pressing further. But Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't walk blindly into a confrontation without evidence. The man in the bedroom, the laughter, he needed answers. And Rachel was about to give them to him, whether she realized it or not. The next few days were a blur of surveillance. Ethan installed a hidden camera in their bedroom and placed voice recorders in Rachel's car and handbag. He had always trusted her implicitly, but now that trust was shattered. Every moment she spent away from him felt like another opportunity for her betrayal to deepen. Each night, Rachel behaved as if nothing was wrong. She was affectionate, playful even, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan doubted himself. Maybe what he saw was a mistake. Maybe he had overreacted. But the late nights, the unexplained absences, and the phone calls she took outside their home told a different story. It wasn't until a week later, after combing through hours of footage, that Ethan found the confirmation he dreaded. Rachel had been meeting the same man at a hotel across town. Their laughter, their intimate touches, it was all there, captured on camera. There was no denying it now. Ethan waited until the kids were at a sleepover. He couldn't bear for them to witness what was about to unfold. Rachel came home from work, her usual cheery demeanor faltering as she saw him sitting in the living room, the hidden camera footage playing on the television. "Rachel," he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "We need to talk." Her face drained of color as the reality of what she was seeing hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The room was silent except for the muffled sounds of her betrayal playing out on the screen. Ethan stood, the weight of the past weeks crashing over him like a tidal wave. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Rachel swallowed, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, how long?" he roared, his fists clenched at his sides. Tears welled in her eyes as she crumbled under the weight of his fury. 6 months, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan closed his eyes, the pain of her confession slicing through him like a blade. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't know," she sobbed. "It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt you." But her words fell flat. There was no excuse for what she had done. Ethan's decision was made that night. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. He had seen enough to know that their marriage, their life, was beyond repair. The next morning, he packed his bags and left, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the woman who had torn his heart to pieces. As he drove away, Ethan realized that while he had lost everything he thought he held dear, he had also gained something precious: his freedom. Rachel's betrayal had destroyed the life they built together, but in its place, he would rebuild something new, stronger, without the lies, and maybe, someday, without the pain. Ethan found himself driving aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go or what to do next. His mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each time feeling like a fresh wound. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty streets, and the reality of his situation weighed heavily on him. He finally pulled into a quiet motel on the outskirts of town, too exhausted to keep driving. The desk clerk handed him a room key, barely looking up as Ethan took it and made his way to the small, dimly lit room. As he sank onto the bed, the loneliness hit him like a freight train. What was he supposed to do now? He had no home to return to, no family to lean on. His children were his only connection to the life he had known, and even that felt distant now. He wanted to call them, to hear their voices and remind himself of the love that still existed in his world. But the thought of explaining why he wasn't coming home tonight stopped him. Instead, Ethan stared blankly at his phone, scrolling through old photos of happier times. Pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, and the kids' first day of school flashed by, each image a painful reminder of what he had lost. He stopped at a photo of Rachel and him on their wedding day, both of them smiling and full of hope for the future. "What happened to us?" he whispered to the empty room. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here forever, wallowing in his pain. He had to move forward, if not for himself, then for his children. But how? How do you rebuild after everything you thought you knew is torn apart? The next morning, Ethan woke to the harsh light streaming through the thin motel curtains. His head throbbed from a sleepless night, and his body felt heavy with exhaustion. But the world hadn't stopped for his grief, and neither could he. He packed his few belongings and checked out of the motel, driving aimlessly once again. He couldn't go back to the house, not yet. He wasn't ready to face the reality of what that place had become. Instead, he found himself at a familiar place, the office of his lawyer, Michael Andrews. Michael had been a friend for years, a steady presence in Ethan's life, especially during the few legal matters that had cropped up in his business dealings. He trusted Michael implicitly, and now he needed his friend's advice more than ever. "Ethan," Michael greeted him, his face a mix of concern and surprise. "What brings you here?" Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I need your help. It's over between Rachel and me." Michael's expression shifted to one of understanding. "Come in, let's talk." They sat in Michael's office, the silence between them heavy as Ethan explained everything: Rachel's affair, the confrontation, and his decision to leave. Michael listened without interruption, his face unreadable as Ethan poured out his heart. "I don't know what to do," Ethan admitted after a long pause. "I can't go back to her, but I don't want to lose my kids. They're the only thing I have left." Michael leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Ethan, you're doing the right thing by getting ahead of this. Divorce is never easy, but you need to protect yourself and your children. We'll file for divorce and make sure that you get fair custody arrangements. But you need to be prepared for a fight. Rachel might not make this easy." Ethan nodded, though the thought of a bitter legal battle made his stomach turn. "I just want what's best for the kids. I don't care about the house or the money. They're all that matters." Michael smiled sadly. "You're a good man, Ethan. We'll make sure your kids are taken care of." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began the painful process of disentangling his life from Rachel's. He stayed with a friend, Jack, a co-worker who had been with him for years. Jack offered him a guest room, no questions asked, and for that, Ethan was grateful. Jack wasn't the kind of man to pry, but he was the kind of friend who knew when to give someone space to heal. The divorce papers were filed, and soon Rachel's lawyer fired back with her own demands. She wanted the house, full custody of the children, and a significant portion of Ethan's business assets. Ethan had expected this. Rachel had always been driven by material security, but the custody demand was a knife to his heart. The idea of seeing his children only on weekends or holidays was unbearable. Michael fought hard for Ethan's rights, arguing that Rachel's infidelity and her decision to prioritize another relationship over her family made her unfit for full custody. But Rachel wasn't backing down. She hired an aggressive lawyer, and every step of the legal process felt like a fresh battle. Despite the stress, Ethan clung to one thing: his love for his children. He refused to let Rachel's betrayal rob him of his relationship with them. He attended every school event, showed up to every practice, and made sure that his kids knew he was still their father, no matter what was happening between him and their mother. He kept his distance from Rachel as much as possible, communicating only through their lawyers or in brief, cold exchanges when they handed the kids off. It was painful, but it was necessary. One evening, Ethan was sitting on the porch of Jack's house, nursing a beer and trying to make sense of the mess his life had become. The divorce proceedings were dragging on, and Rachel's demands seemed to grow more unreasonable by the day. But just as he was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Ethan, it's Lisa. Can we meet? I need to talk to you about Rachel." Ethan stared at the message, his mind racing. Lisa was one of Rachel's closest friends, someone who had been there through their entire marriage. What could she possibly have to say? Curiosity got the better of him, and the next day, he met Lisa at a quiet cafe on the other side of town. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup as she sat across from him. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Ethan replied, though he didn't hide his skepticism. "What's this about?" Lisa took a deep breath. "I've known about Rachel's affair for a while." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He clenched his jaw, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I didn't want to get involved, but I can't keep quiet anymore. I need you to know the truth." Over the next hour, Lisa laid everything out. The man Rachel had been seeing wasn't just some random fling. He had been in their lives for longer than Ethan could have imagined. They had met years ago, before their children were even born, and the affair had been rekindled shortly after their second child's birth. "It wasn't just a few months," Lisa confessed, her eyes filled with guilt. "It's been years. I don't know how Rachel kept it from you for so long, but she did." The weight of her words crushed Ethan. Years. His marriage had been a lie for years. Everything he had thought was real, his children, his family, his life, had been tainted by Rachel's betrayal for far longer than he could have ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ethan asked, his voice raw with emotion. Lisa hesitated. "Because I feel guilty. I should have said something sooner, but Rachel, she's my friend. I didn't want to ruin everything. But now, seeing what this is doing to you, to the kids, I had to come clean." Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "You should have told me sooner, Lisa. You could have saved me from wasting years of my life." Lisa looked down, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry, but it was too late for apologies." Ethan left the cafe, his mind swirling with anger, sadness, and a profound sense of loss. Ethan's conversation with Lisa set something off inside him. He had tried to handle the divorce with dignity, had tried to keep things civil for the sake of the children, but now the full extent of Rachel's betrayal was clear. She had not only destroyed their marriage, but she had been deceiving him for years, living a double life while pretending to be his wife. He couldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. The next morning, Ethan called Michael and told him everything. The years-long affair, the lies, the betrayal. It was time to stop playing nice. "We're going for full custody," Ethan said, his voice cold and determined. Michael didn't argue. He had seen the fire in Ethan's eyes before, and he knew that this was no longer just about protecting the kids. This was about reclaiming Ethan's life from the woman who had taken it from him. The divorce trial dragged on for months, but in the end, Ethan got what he wanted. The judge ruled in his favor, granting him primary custody of the children. Rachel was given visitation rights, but the court saw her infidelity and deceit for what it was, a violation of the trust and stability a family needed. The house, the cars, the money, Rachel could keep it all. Ethan didn't care anymore. What mattered was his children, and the fact that they would grow up knowing that their father fought for them, that he loved them unconditionally, even when everything else had fallen apart. Months passed, and Ethan slowly began to rebuild his life. He found a new home for him and the kids, a modest place filled with love and laughter. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of everything threatened to crush him, when the memories of his shattered marriage crept back in. But Ethan was strong, stronger than he had ever realized. He had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and he had come out the other side, scarred but not broken. And as he tucked his children into bed each night, he knew one thing for certain. He was free. Free from the lies, the deceit, and the pain. His life was his own again, and he was ready to move forward, one day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, he would find love again, real love this time. The hardest part of the entire ordeal wasn't the divorce itself. It wasn't even facing Rachel's continued denial of her responsibility for their failed marriage. No. The hardest part was explaining it all to his children. His daughter, Emily, was 8, and his son, Tyler, was 5. Both too young to fully comprehend what had happened, but old enough to sense that something had changed. They saw the tension between their parents, the way their mom no longer kissed their dad when he came home. They asked questions that Ethan wasn't ready to answer. He knew the day would come when he'd have to sit them down and explain why mommy and daddy were no longer together, why daddy was living in a different house now, and why weekends would mean packing bags and switching homes. That day came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, just after the final court ruling. He had taken the kids to the park, trying to enjoy a few last moments of normalcy before breaking their world apart. They played on the swings, laughed as Ethan pushed them higher and higher, their faces lit up with innocent joy. Finally, they all sat down on a bench, the children tired from running around, and Ethan knew it was time. "Emily, Tyler," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "There's something important I need to talk to you about." The children looked up at him, their wide eyes reflecting trust and love, trust that he wasn't sure he deserved after what he was about to say. "Mommy and we've decided that it's better for us to live in separate houses from now on." Emily's face fell, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean, Daddy?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "It means that you'll spend time with Mommy in one house and time with me in another. We'll still be a family, but things are going to be a little different now." Tyler, too young to understand fully, just frowned. "Why, Daddy?" Why can't we all live together? Ethan's heart shattered. How could he explain something so complicated to children who had only ever known love and stability? How could he make them understand that sometimes adults made choices that hurt the ones they loved, and that sometimes love wasn't enough to fix everything? It's complicated, buddy, he said softly. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I will always love you both. Mommy loves you too. This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. Emily's lip trembled, and Ethan pulled her into his arms as she began to cry softly against his chest. Tyler followed, wrapping his little arms around his sister and father in a tight hug. For the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself to cry. Not from the pain of his own loss, but from the agony of watching his children's hearts break, knowing that their lives would never be the same again. Once the custody arrangements were finalized, Ethan thought the worst was behind him, but he hadn't counted on Rachel's capacity for manipulation. She played the perfect role when the court was involved, calm, collected, and always speaking about what was best for the children. But behind closed doors, Rachel began planting seeds of doubt in the kids' minds. "I'm sorry you have to go back to Daddy's house," she'd say to Emily, her voice full of faux concern. "I know you miss me when you're over there." When Tyler complained about anything at Ethan's home, Rachel pounced on the opportunity. "Well, that's because Daddy doesn't care about making things as nice for you as I do." Slowly but surely, Rachel was turning the children against him, using them as pawns in a game of control and manipulation. Ethan could see the confusion in their eyes when they returned from a weekend with her. They'd ask questions that he knew had come from her. "Why did you leave Mommy?" Or "Mommy says you don't want to live with us anymore. Is that true?" It took everything in Ethan not to explode in anger, to not retaliate by speaking poorly of Rachel to the children. But he refused to stoop to her level. He wouldn't use his own kids as weapons. Instead, he sat them down every time and reassured them. "Your mommy and I both love you very much. We're just living in different houses now. But nothing will ever change how much I love you." He hoped that one day they would see the truth for themselves. Ethan's new house was modest, but it felt like a fresh start. The walls were bare, and the rooms were sparsely furnished, but it was his own space, free from the memories of Rachel and their tainted marriage. He threw himself into making it a home for his kids. He painted their bedrooms in bright, cheerful colors, letting Emily choose a princess theme and Tyler a superhero one. He bought new toys, new bedding, and made sure there were plenty of family photos on the walls. When the kids arrived for their first weekend stay, they were hesitant at first, unsure of the unfamiliar surroundings. But as they explored their new rooms, their faces lit up with excitement, and Ethan felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something new here, something that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past. Ethan focused on being the best father he could be. He took the kids on weekend trips to the zoo, the aquarium, and amusement parks. He attended every school event, every soccer game, and every ballet recital, always making sure that they knew he was there for them, no matter what. And slowly, he began to heal. As the months passed, Rachel grew increasingly bitter. The custody ruling hadn't gone in her favor, and she resented Ethan for it. She tried to stir up more drama, calling Ethan late at night, accusing him of neglecting the children or questioning his parenting decisions. But Ethan refused to engage. He knew Rachel was lashing out because she had lost control, and he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him react. One night, she showed up at his door unannounced, her eyes wild with anger. "This is all your fault," she screamed, pushing past him into the house. "You've ruined everything." Ethan stood firm, his voice calm but stern. "Rachel, you need to leave. This isn't good for the kids, and it isn't good for you." But she wouldn't listen. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you're some kind of hero for taking them from me." "I didn't take them from you," Ethan said, his patience wearing thin. "The court decided based on what was best for them. You have visitation. You're still their mother." "I'm their mother," Rachel spat, tears streaming down her face. "You've poisoned them against me." Ethan shook his head. "No, Rachel. You did that to yourself." Rachel stood there, her chest heaving, her face contorted with rage. But eventually, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, Ethan let out a long breath. It was over. The chapter with Rachel was finally, truly closed. With Rachel out of the picture and the legal battles behind him, Ethan found himself with a new sense of purpose. He had always been a dedicated father, but now his children became the center of his world. He volunteered at their school, signed up to coach Tyler's soccer team, and spent countless evenings helping Emily with her homework. He became the parent he had always wanted to be, fully present, fully engaged. But there was something else too, a spark of curiosity about what his life could be beyond the role of a father. For so long, his identity had been tied to Rachel and their marriage. Now, for the first time in years, he was free to rediscover who he was outside of that relationship. He started going to the gym again, picking up old hobbies he had long since abandoned. He joined a hiking club, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature. And slowly, he began to open himself up to the idea of meeting someone new. He wasn't rushing into anything. After all, his heart was still healing, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so bleak. One Saturday morning, Ethan took the kids to a local farmer's market. It had become one of their favorite weekend traditions, strolling through the stalls, picking out fresh fruits and vegetables, and indulging in homemade pastries. As he stood in line for coffee, a woman standing behind him caught his attention. She was about his age, with long brown hair and a warm smile. She looked vaguely familiar, though Ethan couldn't quite place her. "You look like you could use a strong coffee," she said with a friendly grin. Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, it's been one of those mornings." They struck up a casual conversation, and as they talked, Ethan realized where he had seen her before. She was one of the parents at Emily's school. Her name was Sarah, and she had a son in the same grade. As they chatted, Ethan found himself drawn to her easygoing nature. There was no pressure, no expectations, just a simple, pleasant conversation with someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and as Ethan walked away, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Weeks passed, and Ethan and Sarah's friendship deepened. They met up occasionally for coffee, and their kids became fast friends. It was slow, casual, and exactly what Ethan needed. Sarah knew about his past. He had been upfront about his divorce and the struggles that had followed. But she didn't judge him for it. Instead, she offered kindness and understanding, and Ethan found himself looking forward to their conversations more and more. One evening, after a long day at work, Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a beer and thinking about how far he had come. The wounds from Rachel's betrayal were still there, but they didn't define him anymore. He was no longer the broken man who had crumpled in the kitchen with those plane tickets to the Maldives. He was someone new now, someone stronger, more resilient. And as he looked at the phone in his hand, Sarah's number glowing on the screen, he realized something. He was ready to take another step forward, ready to let go of the past, and ready to embrace whatever the future held. With a deep breath, Ethan dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, and then her warm voice answered. "Hey, Ethan. How are you?" "I'm good," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm really good." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. As weeks turned into months, Ethan began to feel the weight of single parenthood pressing down on him. Balancing his job with his responsibilities as a father was far more difficult than he had anticipated. Each morning, he would wake before dawn to prepare breakfast, pack lunches, and help the kids get ready for school. Evenings were a whirlwind of homework, dinner, and bedtime stories. It wasn't that he minded the work. On the contrary, he loved spending time with Emily and Tyler. But the sheer exhaustion of it all was beginning to take its toll. The few moments of silence he had after the kids were in bed were often spent worrying about whether he was doing enough, whether he was being a good father. He didn't have Rachel to share the burden anymore, and while he didn't miss her presence, he missed the balance they had once had in raising their children. Ethan would sometimes collapse on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long he could keep going at this pace. The strain was starting to show. He wasn't sleeping well, his work was suffering, and the constant pressure of being both mother and father to his kids weighed on him like an anchor. And then there were the moments of doubt, the creeping thoughts that maybe, just maybe, Rachel had been right about him, She had accused him of being distant, emotionally unavailable, and unloving. During their final argument, she had said things that still haunted him, words that echoed in his mind late at night when the world was quiet. "You're a terrible husband," she'd spat, her eyes filled with venom. "You never tried to understand me. You never cared about what I needed." Ethan had dismissed her words at the time, but now, in the quiet moments, he wondered if there was truth in them. Had he failed as a husband? Had he been too focused on work, on providing, to see that his marriage was crumbling around him? He didn't have the answers, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Despite the court's custody ruling, Rachel was far from done trying to exert her influence. Every time the children returned from a weekend with her, they seemed different, more withdrawn, more reluctant to talk about their time with her. Emily, once so close to her father, had begun to pull away, retreating into herself. Tyler, too, seemed quieter than usual, his usual playful nature dimmed. Ethan knew Rachel was saying things to them, planting seeds of doubt and confusion. But the problem was that the children were too young to fully understand what was happening. They couldn't articulate the subtle manipulations, but they felt the tension between their parents, and it was affecting them deeply. One evening, as Ethan was tucking Emily into bed, she looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you love us?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He knelt beside her bed, taking her small hands in his. "Of course I love you, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you ask something like that?" Emily sniffled, her eyes downcast. "Mommy said. She said you left because you didn't love us anymore." Ethan felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him, not in front of his daughter. "That's not true, Emily," he said softly. "I didn't leave because of you or your brother. I left because your mommy and I weren't getting along, but that has nothing to do with how much I love you. You and Tyler are the most important people in my life." Emily's bottom lip quivered, and she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Ethan held her tightly, blinking back tears. How could Rachel do this to them? After Emily had fallen asleep, their children, Ethan sat alone in the living room, his heart heavy with guilt. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know how to fight back against Rachel's influence without dragging the children into the middle of their battle. The last thing he wanted was for them to feel torn between their parents. But he also knew that he couldn't let Rachel continue to manipulate them. He needed to protect his kids from the toxic environment she was creating. Desperate for help, Ethan decided to seek the advice of a child therapist. He knew that Emily and Tyler were struggling to process the divorce, and he wanted to give them the tools they needed to cope. He found a reputable therapist in town, Dr. Megan Lawson, who specialized in working with children from divorced families. During their first session, Ethan sat nervously in the waiting room as the kids met with Dr. Lawson. He hoped they would open up to her, that they would feel comfortable enough to share their feelings about everything that had happened. After the session, Dr. Lawson invited Ethan into her office to discuss her observations. "Your children are clearly going through a lot right now," she said gently. "It's common for kids to feel conflicted after a divorce, especially when they sense tension between their parents. But I do have some concerns." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What kind of concerns?" Dr. Lawson sighed. "Emily mentioned that she feels torn between you and her mother. She said she's worried that if she loves you, she'll be betraying her mother and vice versa. That's a lot of pressure for a child to carry." Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of her words. "What can I do to help her? To help both of them?" "The best thing you can do is to keep reassuring them that they don't have to choose between you and their mother," Dr. Lawson advised. "Continue to create a stable, loving environment for them. It's important that they feel secure with you, and that they know they're allowed to love both of their parents without feeling guilty." Ethan nodded, though the sadness in his heart remained. He hated that his children were being forced into this impossible situation. But at least now, with Dr. Lawson's help, he had a plan. He would make sure that Emily and Tyler knew they were loved unconditionally by both of their parents, no matter how much Rachel tried to poison their minds. Despite Ethan's efforts, the tension between him and Rachel continued to seep into the children's lives. Emily, always the more sensitive of the two, seemed to internalize the conflict the most. She became withdrawn, her once bright personality dimming under the weight of the emotional battle she was caught in. Tyler, meanwhile, began acting out at school, getting into fights with other kids and defying his teachers. Ethan knew that this behavior was a cry for help, a sign that his children were struggling to process the changes in their lives. He tried talking to them, reassuring them that everything would be okay, but the situation felt like it was slipping out of his control. One Friday evening, as Ethan was preparing dinner, Emily and Tyler came into the kitchen, both of them looking unusually serious. "Daddy, can we ask you something?" Emily said quietly. "Of course," Ethan replied, setting down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. "What's on your mind?" Tyler shuffled his feet nervously. "Can we stay with you? Like, all the time?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You don't want to go back to your mom's?" Emily shook her head. "It's not that we don't love her, but it's really hard when we go back and forth. It's confusing. And Mommy says things that make us feel bad." Ethan knelt down in front of them, his heart breaking at the sight of their worried faces. "What kind of things, sweetheart?" "She says that you don't really love us and that we should stay with her all the time," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "But we know that's not true, Daddy. We know you love us." Tears stung Ethan's eyes as he pulled them into a hug. "I love you more than anything in the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Ethan knew he couldn't let this go on. The emotional toll Rachel's manipulations were taking on the children was too great. He had hoped to avoid another legal battle, but it was clear that he needed to fight for full custody. The kids were asking for it, and he couldn't ignore their pleas. The next morning, he called Michael and set up a meeting to discuss his options. "Ethan, I'm not going to lie to you. This won't be easy," Michael said as they sat across from each other in his office. "Courts are generally reluctant to alter custody arrangements unless there's clear evidence of harm. But if we can prove that Rachel's actions are emotionally damaging the kids, we might have a case." "I don't care how hard it is," Ethan replied, his voice resolute. "I can't let her keep messing with their heads. I have to protect them." Michael nodded. "We'll start by gathering evidence. Document everything, every conversation, every time the kids mention something their mother has said to them. If we can build a case that shows a pattern of emotional manipulation, we'll have a better chance of getting the custody arrangement changed." Ethan spent the next several weeks meticulously recording every interaction with Rachel and his children. He kept a journal, noting down the details of every troubling conversation Emily and Tyler relayed to him. He even spoke to their teachers, who confirmed that both children had been struggling in school since the divorce. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but Ethan knew it was the right thing to do. His children deserved better than to be caught in the middle of their parents' war. When the day of the custody hearing finally arrived, Ethan was both anxious and determined. He knew that this was his best chance to protect his children from Rachel's toxic influence, but the stakes were high. If the court didn't rule in his favor, he feared what further damage Rachel could inflict. Rachel, of course, had come prepared. She looked calm and composed, playing the role of the concerned mother perfectly. Her lawyer painted her as a loving, devoted parent who was simply trying to do what was best for her children. But Ethan's lawyer, Michael, was ready. He presented the evidence Ethan had gathered over the past few months. Records of Rachel's manipulative behavior, testimony from the children's teachers, and even a statement from Dr. Lawson, the child therapist, who confirmed that the children had been emotionally affected by Rachel's actions. As the proceedings dragged on, Ethan found himself holding his breath, waiting for the judge's decision. It felt like his entire life was hanging in the balance, and the thought of losing his children was unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence, it is clear to this court that the current custody arrangement is not in the best interest of the children, the judge said. Effective immediately, primary custody will be awarded to Mr. Ethan Granger, with visitation rights granted to Mrs. Rachel Granger. Ethan exhaled, the weight of months of worry lifting from his shoulders. He had won. He had protected his children. The court's decision brought a sense of relief, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with the complexities of co-parenting with someone who had become increasingly bitter. Rachel didn't take the loss well. She tried to appeal the decision, but the evidence was stacked against her. For once, the law had seen through her facade. With primary custody now awarded to him, Ethan knew that Rachel's visitation periods would continue to be a point of contention. He had to set clear boundaries, not only for his sake, but for the children's emotional well-being. Rachel had to learn that her manipulative tactics would no longer work, not under his watch. But the toll of the ongoing battles with Rachel started to manifest in unexpected ways. Ethan noticed that after every visit with their mother, the kids would come home irritable and anxious. Emily, in particular, became increasingly moody, her attitude shifting from the sweet girl she once was into someone plagued by doubt and insecurity. One evening, as Ethan tucked her in, she looked up at him, her eyes tired. "Daddy, why does Mommy hate you?" The question stopped him cold. How was he supposed to explain this to a child? How could he tell her that her mother's bitterness wasn't her fault, nor his? "Your mom doesn't hate me, sweetheart," he said softly. "She's just hurt. Sometimes when adults don't get along, they say things they don't mean." Emily was quiet for a long time, her little fingers clutching the edge of her blanket. "But she says that you left because you didn't love us anymore." Ethan closed his eyes, fighting back the wave of anger that surged through him. This was Rachel's doing, her lies, her manipulation. "That's not true, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you and your brother more than anything in the world. I would never leave you. Not ever." Just when Ethan thought things might finally settle down, Rachel introduced a new variable into the equation. Her new boyfriend, Brad. He was a smooth-talking, successful businessman who seemed to enjoy flaunting his wealth in front of the children. Rachel, desperate to maintain her image of control and power, had quickly moved on with Brad after the custody ruling. She presented him as the perfect partner, someone who could provide for the children in ways that Ethan supposedly couldn't. Ethan tried not to let it get to him. He didn't care who Rachel dated, as long as it didn't affect the kids. But it soon became clear that Brad was more than just a distraction for Rachel. He was becoming a pawn in her continued attempts to undermine Ethan. The first time Brad showed up to pick the kids up from Ethan's house for a weekend visit, the tension was palpable. Brad leaned against his flashy sports car, a smug grin on his face as Ethan approached. "So, how's life treating you, man?" Brad asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Ethan ignored the bait. "I just want to make sure the kids have everything they need for the weekend." Brad chuckled. "Oh, don't worry. I got it covered. We'll be taking them to a beach resort this weekend. Something a little more upscale, you know?" Ethan clenched his jaw but said nothing. It wasn't worth engaging with someone like Brad. His priority was the children, and he wasn't about to let this guy get under his skin. But as the weekends passed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in Emily and Tyler after their visits with Rachel and Brad. They came back talking about how much fun Brad was, how he took them to fancy restaurants and bought them expensive gifts. Emily, in particular, seemed enchanted by Brad's attention, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. He had never been able to afford the kind of luxuries Brad showered on the children, and he worried that they might start to value material things over the love and stability he had always provided. It was a difficult balance, wanting the kids to have fun with their mother and Brad, while also fearing that they were being manipulated by materialism. Ethan reminded himself that his relationship with his children was built on love and trust, not on flashy gifts or fancy vacations. Still, the nagging doubt lingered. What if Rachel and Brad succeeded in turning the kids against him? What if all the progress he had made in creating a stable home for them was undone by Brad's influence? Ethan knew that sooner or later, he would have to confront Rachel about Brad's growing presence in the children's lives. It wasn't that he didn't want her to move on. He understood that she had the right to date whoever she wanted, but Brad's attempts to play the role of super dad were becoming more than Ethan could tolerate. The opportunity came during a rare moment of civility between them. Rachel had come to pick up the kids for a visit, and Brad wasn't with her this time. After the kids ran to the car, excited for their weekend plans, Ethan took a deep breath and spoke up. "Rachel, we need to talk." Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his tone. "About what?" "About Brad," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I get that you're moving on, and that's fine. But the way he's trying to buy the kids, it's not healthy." Rachel's expression hardened. "He's not buying them. He's giving them experiences that you can't provide. Ethan felt his anger rising, but forced himself to stay composed. This isn't about money or vacations. It's about the kids needing stability. They're already dealing with enough because of the divorce, and now they have Brad coming in, trying to be their hero. Rachel crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. You're just jealous because Brad can give them things you can't. That's not what this is about. Ethan snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. I'm not competing with him, but you need to be careful about how much influence he's having on them. They're confused, Rachel. They don't need someone else coming in and complicating things even more. Rachel rolled her eyes. You're overreacting, Ethan. Brad is good to them. They love him. Ethan shook his head, frustrated by her refusal to see the bigger picture. Just think about what's best for the kids. That's all I'm asking. Rachel didn't respond, but the tension between them was palpable. As she drove away with the children, Ethan stood on the porch, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over him. No matter how hard he tried to protect his children, Rachel always seemed to find a way to make things more difficult. The weeks that followed were filled with more of the same. Brad's influence growing stronger, Rachel continuing to sow seeds of division between Ethan and the children. But just when Ethan thought things couldn't get any worse, he received a phone call that turned his world upside down once again. It was from one of Rachel's old friends, someone Ethan hadn't spoken to in years. Ethan, I don't know how to tell you this. The woman's voice trembled, but you need to know the truth about Brad. Ethan's heart raced as he listened to her explain that Brad wasn't the upstanding businessman he claimed to be. In fact, he had a criminal record, a history of fraud and deception that Rachel had apparently been hiding. He's not who he says he is, the woman said. I don't know if Rachel knows the full extent of it, but I thought you should know before it's too late. Ethan's mind raced. This was far worse than he had imagined. If Brad was involved in something illegal, it could have serious consequences for the children. He had to act fast. Armed with the new information, Ethan immediately contacted his lawyer. Together, they gathered the evidence they needed to take action. Ethan knew that if Brad posed any danger to the children, he had to get them out of Rachel's care as soon as possible. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles and tense confrontations. Rachel, of course, denied everything, insisting that Brad was innocent and that Ethan was trying to sabotage her happiness. But the evidence was damning, and in the end, the court had no choice but to intervene. Brad was ordered to stay away from the children, and Rachel's visitation rights were significantly reduced. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of relief. The nightmare was finally over. With Rachel and Brad out of the picture, Ethan could finally focus on what mattered most, his children. The bond between them grew stronger each day, and slowly, the wounds from the past began to heal. Emily and Tyler started to thrive again, their laughter returning, their joy no longer clouded by the turmoil of their parents' divorce. Ethan watched with pride as they blossomed into confident, happy kids, knowing that he had done everything he could to protect them. As for Ethan, he had finally found peace. The journey had been long and painful, filled with heartbreak and challenges, but in the end, he had emerged stronger. He had built a new life for himself and his children, one filled with love, stability, and hope for the future. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for new love in that future too. Life had finally settled into something resembling normalcy. Ethan's days were filled with work, the kids, and the small pleasures that came with building a new life. His mornings started early, making breakfast for Emily and Tyler, packing their lunches, and dropping them off at school before heading to work. His evenings were spent helping with homework, preparing dinner, and tucking them into bed with stories that always left them giggling. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself all those years ago when he married Rachel, but in many ways, it was better. He had found strength he didn't know he had rebuilt himself from the ground up. His kids were thriving, and for the first time in a long time, so was he. But there were still challenges. While Rachel's influence had lessened, she was still a presence in their lives. Her limited visitation rights meant that she saw the kids less frequently. But every time they returned from her home, they carried with them a sadness that weighed heavily on Ethan's heart. "Mommy says she misses us," Emily would say quietly, her eyes downcast. "I know she does, sweetheart," Ethan would reply, his voice gentle. "But you'll see her again soon." It was hard, balancing the need to protect his children from Rachel's manipulations with the desire to let them have a relationship with their mother. Ethan didn't want to be the reason they grew up resenting her, but he also couldn't let her undermine the stability he had worked so hard to create. The therapist's advice echoed in his mind. Keep reassuring them. Create a stable, loving environment, and they will find their way back to you. So that's what Ethan did. Every day he showed up for his kids. He was there for every school play, every soccer game, every moment that mattered. He was determined to be the father they needed, no matter what. Despite the court's ruling, co-parenting with Rachel remained a constant source of stress. She was uncooperative during visitation exchanges, often arriving late or rescheduling at the last minute. The kids were confused by the inconsistency, and Ethan could see the frustration building in them. One Friday afternoon, Rachel was late again, this time by nearly an hour. Ethan sat in his car outside her house, Tyler and Emily in the back seat, growing more restless with each passing minute. "Where's Mommy?" Tyler asked, his voice tinged with impatience. "I'm sure she's on her way, buddy," Ethan said, though he wasn't so sure anymore. He tried calling Rachel, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When she finally arrived, there was no apology, no explanation. She simply ushered the kids out of Ethan's car and into her own, barely sparing him a glance. "Rachel," Ethan called after her, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to talk about this. You can't keep being late. It's confusing for the kids." Rachel didn't even bother to turn around. "They'll be fine," she said dismissively as she buckled Tyler into his seat. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had learned by now that arguing with Rachel only escalated the situation, and it was the kids who suffered the most when things got heated. But as he watched her drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. This wasn't sustainable, for him or the children. He needed a solution, something that would create more stability and less chaos in their lives. Ethan realized that part of his struggle was trying to do everything on his own. He had always prided himself on being independent, but in the wake of the divorce, he had taken that independence to an extreme. He rarely asked for help, even when he needed it. But as the stress of co-parenting with Rachel continued to mount, Ethan began to see the value in leaning on others. He reached out to his parents, who lived a few towns over, and started involving them more in his and the kids' lives. His mother, always eager to help, began picking the kids up from school on days when Ethan had to work late, and his father offered to take Tyler to soccer practice on weekends. It wasn't just his parents either. Ethan reconnected with old friends, many of whom had been there for him during the worst of the divorce, but whom he had pushed away in his attempt to handle everything alone. He started inviting them over for dinners, barbecues, and even the occasional movie night with the kids. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch with Jack, his co-worker and longtime friend, he realized just how much he had missed these moments of camaraderie. "I don't know how you've been doing it, man," Jack said, taking a sip of his beer. "Raising 2 kids on your own, dealing with Rachel. It's a lot." Ethan shrugged, though he felt the weight of Jack's words. "I didn't really have a choice." Jack nodded. "Yeah, but still, you're doing a great job. Those kids are lucky to have you." Ethan smiled, grateful for the affirmation. "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate that." The truth was, Ethan had spent so much time doubting himself, wondering if he was doing enough, if he was enough, that he hadn't stopped to acknowledge how far he had come. But now, sitting here with Jack, watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of Emily and Tyler playing in the yard, Ethan allowed himself to feel a small sense of pride. He wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers, but he was trying every single day to be the best father he could be. And that was enough. As the months passed, Ethan noticed that Tyler was becoming more withdrawn. His usual energetic, playful nature had been replaced by a quiet sadness that Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on. He tried talking to Tyler, asking if something was bothering him, but the boy would just shrug and say, "I'm fine, Dad." But Ethan knew better. Something was wrong. It wasn't until Tyler's teacher called him in for a meeting that Ethan realized just how much his son was struggling. "Mr. Granger, I'm concerned about Tyler," Mrs. Harmon said, her brow furrowed as she sat across from Ethan. "He's been acting out in class. Nothing serious, just some defiance and refusal to participate. But it's not like him. He's always been such a well-behaved, engaged student. Ethan felt a knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. Had he been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't noticed Tyler's? "I'm not sure what's going on," Ethan admitted. "He hasn't said anything to me, but things have been tough at home, with the divorce and all." Mrs. Harmon nodded sympathetically. Divorce can be incredibly hard on children, even when they don't show it outright. Tyler may be internalizing a lot of the emotions he's feeling: sadness, anger, confusion. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What can I do to help him?" "I would suggest talking to him more about his feelings," Mrs. Harmon said gently. "Let him know that it's okay to be sad or angry, and that you're there for him no matter what. If he continues to struggle, it might be worth considering counseling just to give him a safe space to express what he's going through." Ethan nodded, taking her words to heart. He knew he needed to do more for Tyler, to make sure his son felt supported and loved. In an effort to reconnect with Tyler and help him open up, Ethan decided to plan a special father-son weekend. He booked a cabin in the mountains, just a few hours' drive from home, and arranged for Emily to stay with his parents for the weekend. Tyler was excited when Ethan told him about the trip, his eyes lighting up at the thought of spending a few days fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. As they drove up the winding mountain roads, the tension that had been hanging over them for weeks seemed to lift. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, animatedly talking about the different animals they might see on their hikes. And for the first time in a while, Ethan saw a glimpse of the carefree boy his son used to be. When they arrived at the cabin, they spent the first afternoon exploring the surrounding woods, Tyler leading the way with his little compass, determined to find the best fishing spot. That evening, after a long day of hiking, they sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and gazing up at the stars. Ethan watched as Tyler's face, illuminated by the flickering flames, seemed to soften, his usual guarded expression replaced by one of contentment. "Tyler," Ethan said gently, breaking the comfortable silence, "I want you to know that you can always talk to me. About anything. I know things have been tough lately with the divorce and everything, but I'm here for you. Always." Tyler poked at his marshmallow, his brow furrowed in thought. "I know, Dad," he said quietly. "It's just hard sometimes." Ethan nodded, giving his son the space to continue. "I miss how things used to be," Tyler admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I miss when we were all together." Ethan's heart ached at his son's words. He wished he could take away Tyler's pain, wished he could fix everything, but he knew that wasn't possible. "I know, buddy," Ethan said softly. "I miss it too, but things are going to be okay. We're going to be okay. It's just going to take some time." Tyler nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Do you think Mommy's ever going to stop being mad at you?" Ethan sighed, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to lie to his son, but he also didn't want to burden him with the complexities of adult relationships. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But no matter what, we're going to keep moving forward. We have each other, and that's what matters." Tyler looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you promise?" Ethan smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "I promise." While Ethan was making strides in reconnecting with Tyler, his relationship with Emily remained more fragile. She had always been closer to her mother, and despite Rachel's manipulations, Emily still clung to the hope that her parents might one day get back together. Ethan knew that the longer this hope lingered, the harder it would be for Emily to fully heal from the divorce. But how could he gently break it to her that things between him and Rachel were beyond repair? One evening, after Emily had finished her homework, Ethan sat down beside her on the couch, his heart heavy with what he knew he had to say. "Emily, can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. Emily looked up at him, sensing the weight of his words. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know things have been hard for you since the divorce, and I know that sometimes it feels like maybe things could go back to the way they used to be." Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of hope passing across her face. "You mean you and Mommy might get back together?" Ethan's heart clenched, but he knew he had to be honest with her. "No, sweetheart. Mommy and we're not going to get back together. We both love you and your brother very much, but we're not going to be a family in the same way we used to be." Emily's face fell, and for a moment, Ethan feared that he had crushed her spirit. But then, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't you and Mommy just try again?" Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried softly against his chest. "Sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to," he said gently. "And I know that's hard to understand, but it doesn't mean that we don't love you and Tyler. It just means that Mommy and I are better off living in different houses." Emily sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I want us all to be together again." Ethan's heart broke for his daughter, but he knew that this was part of the healing process. She needed to grieve the loss of the family she had known, and only then could she begin to move forward. "I know, sweetheart," Ethan whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I know." As the years of turmoil faded into the background, Ethan found something he hadn't expected: peace. It came in the form of Kate, someone who understood him in ways he hadn't thought possible. She was kind, patient, and carried her own scars from a difficult past. They met through mutual friends, and over time, what began as casual conversations over coffee turned into something more. Kate had her own children, and she, like Ethan, was navigating the rocky terrain of single parenthood. They took things slow, careful not to rush into anything that could complicate their already complex lives. But slowly, Ethan realized he wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was opening himself up to love again. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Ethan and Kate sat on his porch, sipping wine and watching the stars. It felt natural, comfortable, as if they had always been in each other's lives. "I never thought I'd feel this again," Ethan admitted, his voice low, almost hesitant. "After everything that happened, I didn't think I had it in me to love someone new." Kate smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the porch light. "Love isn't something you find, it's something you build. And I think we've both been building it, brick by brick." Ethan looked at her, feeling a warmth spread through him. He knew then that while the pain of his past had shaped him, it didn't define him. He could move forward with Kate by his side and create something real, something lasting. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man stepping into his future, one filled with love, hope, and the family he had always dreamed of. And in that quiet moment, under the stars, Ethan finally felt whole again.